The rain was a percussion section against the wide, curved windshield of the 817 bus to Hope Street. Arthur Pembroke guided the 40-foot Leviathan through the slick, gray veins of the city with a touch so gentle it was almost a caress. His hands, leathery and mapped with veins like old rivers, rested lightly on the steering wheel. At 68, Arthur had been piloting this same route for 22 years. He knew its every pothole, every tricky intersection, the way the morning sun would glare blindingly off the glass towers of the financial district, and the particular damp smell of wet wool and exhaustion that filled the bus on days like this. He was a man of quiet routines. His world was measured in stops and starts, in the hiss of pneumatic doors and the clatter of change in the fare box. He knew his passengers in fragments: the harried young mother with the twin toddlers who always dropped her purse, the group of construction workers who smelled of sawdust and coffee, the students with their faces glued to phone screens, their lives a silent movie he observed from the driver's seat. He was a part of the city's infrastructure, as invisible and essential as the sewer lines or the electrical grid. Most days, he preferred it that way. Then came the woman at the Cedar Avenue stop. It had started 6 months ago, a small, unremarkable alteration in the fabric of his day. The bus would pull up to the sheltered stop, and she would be there, always alone. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with a quiet elegance that seemed out of place amid the grimy urban bustle. Her hair, a silvery gray, was always neatly styled, and she wore clothes that were simple but impeccably tailored: a navy blue coat in the winter, a light trench in the spring, always with a scarf of a single, vibrant color, a slash of emerald green or a burst of saffron yellow. She never fumbled for her pass. She never spoke on the phone. She would bore with a soft, "Good morning," her voice a low, melodic contrail in the air, take the same seat, the first one on the right, just behind the wheelchair bay, and place her leather satchel on her lap. She didn't read a book or scroll through a phone. She simply looked out the window, her expression one of calm observation, as if the city passing by was a fascinating, ever-changing painting. The ritual began subtly. One Tuesday, as she was about to disembark at her usual stop, the library on Hope Street, Arthur, feeling a strange, uncharacteristic impulse, had said, "Mind the step, it's slick." She had turned, her gray eyes meeting his in the wide rearview mirror, and offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. I will." The next day, as she boarded, she paused and said, "The cherry blossoms on Elm are just about to burst. A day or two at most." It was a statement offered to the air, but it was meant for him. He nodded, his eyes finding hers in the mirror. "Always a pretty sight," he'd replied. And so it grew, a daily, quiet exchange, never more than a sentence or two, conducted through the reflection of the rearview mirror. He'd comment on the traffic, warning of a delay up ahead. She'd point out a new mural painted on a previously derelict wall. He told her when the heat on the bus was temperamental. She told him when the little bakery at her stop had started making a particularly excellent almond croissant. These tiny, shared moments became a secret thread stitching through the mundane tapestry of their days. For Arthur, the 817 run was no longer just a job. It was a journey that contained a brief, bright point of human connection. He found himself looking forward to the Cedar Avenue stop with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He wondered about her, this serene woman with the colorful scarves. What was her name? What was her story? Her name was Clara, and her story, like Arthur's, was one of quiet aftermath. She lived in a small, sunlit apartment filled with books and plants, a peaceful sanctuary 2 blocks from the Cedar Avenue bus stop. She was a retired archivist, a profession that had suited her love for order and her reverence for the past. For 35 years, she had worked at the City Museum, preserving letters, documents, and photographs, safeguarding the whispers of lives long gone. Her husband, David, a lively, boisterous man who had filled their home with music and spontaneous plans, had passed away 4 years ago from a swift and brutal cancer. His absence had left a silence so profound it was like a physical presence. The first year was a blur of grief, a colorless landscape through which she moved like a ghost. The second year was worse. The shock had worn off, leaving only the raw, aching reality of being alone. Taking the bus had been a part of her therapy. David had always driven. The bus was a way to re-engage with the world on her own terms, to be among people without having to interact with them. The 817 to Hope Street took her to the library, where she now volunteered, cataloging new acquisitions. It was a small purpose, a way to keep her mind and hands busy. Arthur, the bus driver, had entered her consciousness gradually. She appreciated his driving, so smooth and confident, unlike some of the younger drivers who jerked the bus around as if it were a go-kart. She noticed his kind eyes, the way he had infinite patience for elderly passengers struggling with their walkers, and the gentle, fatherly tone he used with children. Their small exchanges became the cornerstone of her re-emergence into life. In a mirror, she saw a man who was steady, observant, and gentle. His comments were never frivolous. They were observations about the world they were moving through together. She started looking for things to tell him, little details she knew he would appreciate. The first frost on a park bench, the return of a specific breed of bird to the city square. It was a game, a shared secret. She found herself dressing with a little more care on mornings she knew she would see him, choosing a scarf she thought might catch his eye in the mirror. That daily, wordless connection, that brief meeting of eyes, became the highlight of her day, a tiny flame of warmth in the large, cold house of her widowhood. The seasons turned. The cherry blossoms on elm burst into a cloud of pink and then scattered their petals like confetti. The humid heat of summer settled over the city, making the bus windows foggy. Arthur started carrying a small cooler with a few bottles of cold water, and one particularly sweltering morning, as Clara boarded looking flushed, he wordlessly offered her one. The look of surprised gratitude on her face was worth more than any fare. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, having read it on the placard by the door. "You're welcome, Clara," he replied, having learned her name weeks ago from her library pass. This new intimacy, the use of names, deepened their silent ritual. They began to share slightly more. "Tough crowd this morning," he muttered into the mirror after a particularly argumentative group of passengers had disembarked. She smiled. "The city is full of symphonies, but some only hear the traffic." He chuckled, a low, rusty sound he hardly recognized as his own. He told her about his daughter, living in Vancouver, and how he missed his grandkids. She, in turn, mentioned she was a volunteer at the library, and that she'd once worked to preserve a collection of love letters from the 19th century. They were two satellites, each in their own solitary orbit, who had found a constant, comforting gravitational pull in the other. The bus was their neutral territory, a moving sanctuary where the pressures of their pasts and the loneliness of their presence could not reach them. For 22 minutes each weekday, they were not a lonely widower and a grieving widow. They were Arthur and Clara, fellow observers on the 817 to Hope Street. The conflict began, as it often does, not with a bang, but with a change in the weather. Autumn arrived, and with it, a new city initiative. Notices were posted in the staff room. Route optimization and modernization. The 817 to Hope Street, due to its lower ridership numbers compared to the express routes, was being considered for discontinuation. A final decision would be made after a review period. Arthur read the notice, his heart sinking like a stone. This route, their route, was more than just a line on a map. It was his kingdom, his purpose, and at its heart was the Cedar Avenue stop. The thought of never seeing Clara again, of this daily ritual being abruptly severed by a bureaucrat's signature, filled him with a panic he hadn't felt since his wife's final illness. He couldn't bring himself to tell her. Not yet. It felt like inviting bad luck. So he remained silent, but the worry etched new lines on his face. Clara noticed. His greetings became more subdued. The light in his eyes when they met hers in the mirror seemed dimmer. She wondered if she had done something wrong, if the delicate balance of their friendship had been upset. One morning, he was uncharacteristically late. The bus snarled in a detour caused by a water main break. When he finally pulled up to Cedar Avenue, his face was a mask of stress and apology. "I'm so sorry, Clara. The whole of Maple is closed off." "It's quite all right, Arthur," she said, her voice soft with concern. "These things happen." But they didn't, not on Arthur's bus. He was famously, reliably punctual. The disruption felt like an omen. The true turning point came on a crisp October morning. Arthur was waiting for her at the stop, his usual warm smile replaced by a grim set to his jaw. As she boarded, he didn't meet her eyes. He just stared straight ahead. "Clara," he said, his voice tight, "I have to tell you something." Her breath caught in her throat. "What is it? Are you all right?" "It's the route. The 8:17. They're canceling it. In 2 weeks." The words fell between them like stones. The world seemed to slow down. The sounds of the city faded into a dull roar. Clara felt a physical pain, a sharp twist in her chest. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a loss. A profound and deeply personal loss. "No," she whispered, her hand gripping the back of his seat. "They can't." "They can," he said, finally turning to look at her. The despair in his eyes mirrored her own. "It's official." The bus ride that day was silent. The ritual was broken. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The shared space inside the bus was filled with the heavy, unspoken weight of their impending separation. The highlight of their days was being systematically dismantled, and neither of them knew how to stop it. For 2 days, a pall hung over the 8:17. The other passengers, oblivious, went about their lives, but between the driver's seat and the first seat on the right, a silent grief prevailed. Clara felt herself retreating into the shell she had so carefully begun to emerge from. The world seemed grayer, the silence in her apartment louder. It was on the 3rd day, as she watched Arthur's slumped shoulders, that the archivist in her awoke. She was a preserver of stories, a keeper of things that mattered. What she had with Arthur mattered. This bus, this route was their story, and she would be damned if she would let it be canceled, erased from the record without a fight. She arrived at the library that day with a new, fierce energy. Instead of heading to the cataloging room, she went to the public computers. She researched city bylaws, public transit funding, and petition procedures. She found the contact information for every city council member and the head of the transit authority. That evening, she didn't take the bus home. She walked, her mind racing. She sat at her small desk, a cup of tea cooling beside her, and began to write. She didn't write a dry, formal complaint. She wrote a story. She wrote about a bus driver named Arthur, whose gentle hands and kind eyes made a 40-foot bus feel like a safe harbor. She wrote about the invisible community that formed on the 8:17. The young mother, the construction workers, the students, and the retired archivist with her colorful scarves. She wrote about the daily ritual of shared observations, a simple human connection that was a bulwark against the crushing loneliness of a big city. She wrote about how this wasn't just a bus route. It was a lifeline. She printed dozens of copies. The next morning, she was at the Cedar Avenue stop early, not with her usual calm, but with a stack of papers and a determined fire in her eyes. When Arthur pulled up, she boarded and handed him the top sheet. "What's this?" he asked, confused. "Our story," she said firmly. "I'm not letting this go without a fight. I need you to help me." Arthur read the first few paragraphs, his eyes widening. He saw himself through her words, not as an invisible functionary, but as a pillar of small community. He saw the profound importance of what they had. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks, a spark of hope ignited in his chest. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The following week was a whirlwind. Clara became the general of a one-woman army, with Arthur as her lieutenant. She stood at the bus stop every morning, handing out copies of her letter and a petition she had drafted. Arthur, using his encyclopedic knowledge of his regulars, gently encouraged them to sign. "This is Clara," he'd say. "She's trying to save our bus." The passengers, who had been background characters in their story, now became active participants. The young mother shared the petition on her neighborhood social media group. The construction workers promised to talk to their union rep. One of the students, a journalism major, wrote a piece for the local paper featuring Clara and Arthur and the fight for the 8:17. The city council received dozens of emails and calls. The story of the quiet bus driver and the elegant archivist and their daily ritual had captured people's imaginations. It was a tangible, human story in the face of cold, impersonal statistics. The climax arrived with a public forum at City Hall. The Transit Authority was presenting its final recommendations. Clara and Arthur went together. She wore her brightest scarf, a brilliant crimson. He wore his best and only suit. When the floor was open for public comment, Clara stood up. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice was clear and steady. She read her letter aloud, her words filling the sterile chamber. She spoke of community, of connection, of the small, essential threads that hold the social fabric together. Then, she turned and pointed to Arthur, who was sitting in the front row. "And that man," she said, her voice ringing with emotion, "is more than a driver. He is a witness to our lives. He is a moment of grace in a rushed morning. To cancel his route is not just a budget cut. It is an act of violence against the human spirit." When she finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by a burst of applause. Arthur, his eyes glistening, stood up and joined her at the podium. He wasn't a public speaker, but he didn't need to be. He simply said, "Thank you, Clara, for everything." And he took her hand. The photograph of them, standing together at the podium, hand in hand, her in her red scarf and him in his ill-fitting suit, was on the front page of the paper the next day. The headline read, "The 817 to Hope, a route to the heart of the city." They did not cancel the route. The Transit Authority, swayed by the public outcry and the powerful human interest of the story, announced a 1-year reprieve to explore other funding options. The 817 was saved. The victory was sweet, but the real resolution was more personal. The battle had shattered the invisible barrier of the bus. The next morning, when Clara boarded at Cedar Avenue, everything was different, yet beautifully the same. Arthur was smiling, a real, unburdened smile. "Good morning, Clara." "Good morning, Arthur." She didn't go to her usual seat. She paused by his driver's seat. The bus was empty for a moment, suspended in time. "I was thinking," Arthur said, his voice a little shy. "My shift ends at the depot at 4:30. There's a small cafe nearby. They say the coffee is adequate, but the company, I was hoping the company might be excellent." Clara felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. It was the warmth of a new beginning. "I would like that very much, Arthur." She finally took the seat directly behind him, no longer needing the mirror to connect. The ritual had evolved. It had grown beyond the bus, beyond the 817. As Arthur pulled the bus away from the curb and into the flow of the city, he felt a sense of wholeness he hadn't known was possible. He was no longer just a bus driver on a route. He was a man who had been seen and valued and fought for. And Clara, looking out at the city she had helped to change, knew she was no longer just a passenger or a widow or an archivist. She was a woman who had found her voice again, and in doing so, had found a friend. The bus rolled on, its destination no longer just a street on a map, but a state of being. It was, and always would be, the 817 to Hope Street.